Hi, I'm Dr. James Boyes. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at University College London's Centre on US Politics. I'm also a published author, and my previous publications have examined Bill Clinton's administration, his approach to counterterrorism strategy, and also a political biography of his wife, Hillary Clinton. My latest work, US Grand Strategy and the Madman Theory, brings that research bang up to date, and it focuses upon how Donald Trump has followed in the footsteps of Richard Nixon and Dwight D. Eisenhower to utilise a provocative approach to foreign policy in an attempt to exert maximum pressure on America's international opponents. It's published by Manchester University Press, and I hope you enjoy it. At the heart of my new book is the concept of the Madman Theory. But what is the Madman Theory? Well, the Madman Theory is a tactic employed as part of a wider strategy. It is utilised by a sane leader who feigns a rationality in an attempt to convince his opponent that there is a 1% chance that he will enact a disproportionate response in an attempt to get his own way in any negotiating scenario. We see this playing out in trade and foreign policy in a series of incidents across the Cold War and up to modern day. But what are the origins of this? It has its intellectual origins here in Boston, Massachusetts, on the campus of Harvard University. In the 1950s, three academics, Thomas Schelling, Daniel Ellsberg, and Henry Kissinger, are all attempting to devise new strategies to wage the Cold War. And from those three men come three individual ideas, which, when combined, form the intellectual basis for the Madman Theory. From Schelling comes the suspension of rationality. From Daniel Ellsberg, the political use of madness. And from Henry Kissinger, the concept of a limited nuclear war. These three men, working independently on the campus of Harvard University and at the Rand Corporation in California, come up with these three ideas with which to engage the world through a new concept of grand strategy. Central to any understanding of the Madman Theory is Richard Nixon, who during the 1950s served as America's second ever youngest vice president to Dwight D. Eisenhower, at that point America's oldest president. Coming into office in 1953, the Eisenhower administration inherited the Korean War, which it was determined to end as swiftly as possible. During that first year in office, Vice President Nixon routinely attended National Security Council meetings, at which the potential use of America's nuclear arsenal on the Korean Peninsula was debated on several occasions. At the height of the war, the Eisenhower administration was believed to have passed a secret message through India threatening the use of America's nuclear weapons if the war was not ended. Whether this indeed occurred, whether it was indeed effective, is actually of little consequence, because in the minds of Richard Nixon and Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, it was believed to have been effective, and therefore emerged as a new approach with which to engage American foreign policy moving forward as Richard Nixon became President of the United States. 8 years after his devastating defeat to Senator John F. Kennedy in the 1960 election, Richard Nixon finally achieved his lifelong goal of becoming President of the United States. One of his very first acts as President-elect was to name Dr. Henry Kissinger as his national security advisor. In so doing, he brought the political and intellectual basis for the Madman Theory to the highest echelons of America's national security architecture. Coming into office in January 1969, the Nixon administration inherited the Vietnam War, which it was determined to end as swiftly as possible. To do so, it employed the Madman Theory, derived from Nixon's experience as vice president and Kissinger's experience at Harvard University. It did so by employing what seemed to be irrational policies across Vietnam. This involved enhanced bombing at a time when many believed that the bombing campaign should have ended. It also involved the Vietnamization policy. Whilst the initial focus was an attempt to get the leadership in North Vietnam to the negotiating table, the ultimate focus was the Kremlin, and it was made very clear to the Soviet Union that any ongoing peace talks would be getting nowhere if the Vietnam War was not brought to a rapid cessation. The leadership in Moscow and Hanoi, however, appeared unmoved by Richard Nixon's attempt to implement the Madman Theory, ensuring that the war dragged on for a further 4 years. Ironically, perhaps, one of the final victims of the Madman Theory was Richard Nixon himself. His secret bombings of Cambodia, without congressional approval, ultimately formed one of the 4 articles of impeachment which led to his removal from office
in August 1974.
When Richard Nixon departed the White House, it was believed that that was the end, both for him and for the concept of the madman theory. Surely there could be no comeback for either. Ultimately, however, Richard Nixon did make something of a comeback, emerging as an elder statesman and publishing several best-selling books before his death in 1994. The madman theory continued to be misconstrued and misapplied, particularly to the presidency of Ronald Reagan during the 1980s. In 2015, however, a new presidential candidate emerged, and this time the question wasn't, is he employing the madman theory, but rather, is he a madman? During the 1980s, Donald Trump's flamboyant lifestyle and penchant for self-promotion ensured that he became a household name around the world. He also engaged in political activity. At one point, he offered to negotiate arms control agreements between the United States and the Soviet Union, something which perhaps unsurprisingly the Reagan White House declined. He became a best-selling author in 1987 with The Art of the Deal. He went on to star in the TV show The Apprentice. All of these incidents ensured that there were repeated calls for him to run for the presidency, a call he finally answered in June of 2015. A key chapter in my new book addresses Donald Trump's embrace of the madman theory during his first term in office. When he entered the White House in January 2017, he and his administration inherited three ongoing challenges: China's unfair trade practices and currency manipulation, ongoing tensions in the Middle East led by Iran, and North Korea's continuing efforts to develop an ICBM capable of striking the United States. Through the use of the madman theory and fiery rhetoric, Donald Trump embraced and engaged all three of these challenges. He ordered drone strikes to assassinate a key member of the Al-Quds force in Iran. He engaged in continuing trade negotiations with China. And finally, he met up with the young leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-un, to quell the ongoing crisis between the two countries. And in all three cases, therefore, was seen to have used the madman theory to further reduce tensions with America's growing international adversaries. Richard Nixon used the madman theory on America's enemies. Donald Trump, by contrast, utilized the madman theory with America's allies, including those in NATO. Donald Trump's predecessors, George W. Bush and Barack Obama, had both sought increases from European allies of their defense expenditure to 2% of GDP. They failed miserably. Donald Trump, however, utilized the madman theory. He threatened to leave the military alliance, and in so doing, managed to convince European allies to increase their defence expenditure to 5% of GDP during his second term in office. No book that examines Donald Trump's use of the madman theory can overlook his actions upon his return to office in 2025. Upon retaking the White House, Donald Trump issued a series of seemingly irrational statements that discussed the return of the Panama Canal to American control, the renaming of the Gulf of Mexico, and the potential for an armed invasion of Greenland. No area, however, best exemplified his use of the madman theory than the tariff policy. April 2nd, 2025 was designated Liberation Day, as the White House instigated a series of sweeping tariffs on America's trading allies around the world. Despite the heated rhetoric of the moment, this was seen to succeed, as nation after nation lined up to renegotiate trade deals with the United States, delivering billions of dollars into the American economy. Was this extreme coercive diplomacy, as the White House would believe, or the use of the madman theory? Only time, and hopefully my new book, will provide the answers. All of these elements are addressed in my new book, along with a variety of other concepts, including the way in which madness itself has permeated American society, how American political leaders are routinely having their sanity questioned, and the way in which the madman theory itself has now permeated American society, culture, and the arts. US Grand Strategy and the Madman Theory is available from Manchester University Press, and I hope that you enjoy reading it as much as I enjoyed researching it. Cheers.